On the night of July 18, 1986, three armed men left their homes in Rains County, Texas. By sunrise, 14 people lay dead across a 30-mile radius of rural East Texas. It wasn't drugs. It wasn't cartel warfare. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It started over a failed health inspection at a fried chicken stand. A $500 fine that Bill Turner couldn't afford to pay. The fog rolled thick across the county roads that night, muffling the sound of pickup trucks on gravel and the crack of rifle fire in the pre-dawn darkness. What began as a family's desperate fight for dignity became one of the most brutal civilian massacres in modern Texas history. If you have the courage to hear this story, like and subscribe. The following contains descriptions of graphic violence based on real events. By March of 1986, Emory, Texas, population 843, had the hollow feel of a town that had outlived its purpose. The cotton gin stood rusted and silent. Main Street storefronts displayed faded going-out-of-business signs from years prior, their windows soap-streaked and opaque. The only businesses still operating were a Dairy Queen, a feed store, and Turner Fried Chicken, a cinder-block building with a hand-painted sign and a gravel parking lot that turned to mud when it rained. Bill Turner had inherited the business from his father in 1971. For 15 years, he'd worked 7 days a week, arriving before dawn to prep the fryers and staying until the last customer left. His hands were perpetually scarred from oil burns, his back bent from decades of standing over a hot stove. At 52, he looked 70. The Turner family lived in a single-wide trailer on 5 acres outside town. Bill's wife had left in 1982, taking their daughter with her. That left Bill and his 2 sons, Mark, 28, and James, 24, to run the restaurant and manage what little remained of their lives. Mark had done 2 years at community college before dropping out to help his father. James had never left Rains County at all. The 3 men shared a wordless understanding born from years of poverty and disappointment. They ate dinner together most nights at a folding table in the trailer's narrow kitchen. Fried chicken from unsold inventory, instant mashed potatoes, white bread. The TV provided the only conversation, its blue light flickering across their tired faces. Outside, the Texas prairie stretched flat and empty. The wind carried the smell of drought and diesel fuel. At night, the only sounds were distant trains and the metallic ping of the trailer's roof expanding and contracting with temperature changes. This was the landscape that shaped them, vast, indifferent, unforgiving. By April, the debts had become impossible to ignore. Bill owed $12,000 to suppliers, $3,400 in back taxes, and $1,800 to the power company. Collection notices arrived daily. The phone rang with creditors' calls that went unanswered. The restaurant still served customers, regulars mostly, elderly, people who remembered when Turner's had been the center of community life. But the profit margin on a $3.99 chicken dinner couldn't cover the mounting expenses. Bill had tried everything. Cheaper oil, smaller portions, cutting Mark and James's already meager wages. Nothing worked. Some evenings after closing, Bill would sit alone in the empty restaurant, a cigarette burning down between his fingers, and stare at the framed photograph on the wall, his father in Army uniform, 1944, young and proud. That man had survived Normandy and built something with his bare hands. Bill had only managed to watch it slowly die. Mark understood his father's silence better than words could express. He saw the same exhaustion in his own reflection, the premature gray hair, the deep lines around his eyes. At 28, he felt 50. He'd given up his own future to prop up a failing business in a dying town. And for what? So they could limp along for another few months before losing everything anyway? James was younger, angrier. He talked about leaving, finding work in Dallas or Houston, but never did. Some invisible tether kept him bound to Emory, to his father and brother, to the only life he'd ever known. The three men were drowning in slow motion, and they all knew it. What they didn't know was that the water was about to close over their heads entirely. Robert Finch arrived at Turner Fried Chicken on May 14, 1986 at 10:47 a.m., driving a white Ford Tempo with county plates. He was 41 years old, a health inspector for Rains County for 9 years. He wore glasses, kept his hair neatly trimmed, and approached his job with the precise attention to detail that made him either respected or despised, depending on who you asked. Finch had cited Turner's 3 times in the past 18 months. The violations were legitimate: improper food storage temperatures, inadequate hand-washing facilities, grease traps that hadn't been cleaned in years. Each citation came with a fine. Each fine went unpaid. This visit was different. Finch had decided to escalate. If the Turners wouldn't comply voluntarily, he'd recommend the county shut them down entirely. Bill was working the fryer when Finch walked in. Mark was at the register. The inspector pulled out his clipboard without greeting and began his inspection. 20 minutes later, he found what he was looking for: the same grease trap violations as before, now compounded by repeated non-compliance. "Mr. Turner," Finch said, his voice calm and bureaucratic, "I'm issuing a final notice. You have 30 days to correct these violations, or we'll proceed with closure proceedings." Mark stepped forward. "We can't afford the repairs right now. Give us 60 days. "The regulation is 30 days, Finch replied. "I didn't write the rules, but I enforce them." "You've been targeting us," Mark said, his voice rising. "Other places in this county are worse, and you know it." Finch closed his clipboard. "If you feel I'm being unfair, you can file a complaint with the county. Until then, 30 days. He left without another word, the glass door swinging shut behind him. Through the window, they watched him drive away, his white Tempo disappearing into the midday glare. Mark's hands were shaking. Bill stood motionless at the fryer, staring at nothing. It was the last time Robert Finch would visit Turner Fried Chicken. That evening, Bill called a family meeting. The 3 men sat in the trailer's cramped living room, the spring air heavy and still through the open windows. Bill spoke quietly, his voice worn thin by years of disappointment. "We're finished," he said. "Even if we fix the grease traps, we can't pay the fines. And Finch won't stop. He'll find something else to cite us for. He's made up his mind." James lit a cigarette. "So what do we do?" Bill looked at his sons, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in months. He saw his own failure reflected in their faces, his own broken dreams replicated in their stunted lives. He thought about his father, about what that man would have done when faced with impossible odds and no way out. "We make them understand," Bill said, "that there are consequences." Mark knew what his father meant. They all did. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Later, investigators would examine that conversation through court testimony. James would claim his father had only been talking about intimidation, maybe a confrontation, not violence. Mark would say his father had been specific about his intentions from the start. The truth, as with most family secrets, died in that trailer and was never fully resurrected. What is certain is this: that night, Bill Turner crossed a line in his mind that couldn't be uncrossed. Years of accumulated rage at his failed business, his departed wife, his wasted life, found a target. Robert Finch became the personification of every bureaucrat, every creditor, every force that had ground him down into nothing. And once Bill made his decision, his sons followed. Not because they agreed necessarily, but because family loyalty was the only value they had left. In Rains County in 1986, that loyalty ran deeper than law, deeper than reason, deeper than self-preservation. Over the next 6 weeks, the plan took shape in fragments and half-spoken suggestions. Bill studied Finch's routine, learned his roots, identified the other county officials who worked alongside him. The health inspector wasn't acting alone. He had supervisors, colleagues, a whole system supporting his authority. In Bill's increasingly distorted logic, they were all complicit. They were all legitimate targets. Mark obtained a county employee directory from the public library, photocopying pages that listed names, addresses, and phone numbers. He told the librarian he needed it for a letter-writing campaign about road maintenance. She didn't question it. James drove the county roads at night, noting which houses stayed lit late, which driveways held vehicles, which locations offered cover. He was methodical, almost detached, as though surveying terrain for some abstract military exercise rather than planning mass murder. The weapons were already in the house. Bill's .30-06 hunting rifle, inherited from his father, a Remington 870 shotgun, and a .357 revolver Mark had bought years earlier for home protection. They'd owned these guns their entire lives, used them for deer hunting and target practice. Now they cleaned and oiled them with a different purpose in mind. Court records would later show that Bill Turner made one attempt at a legal remedy. On June 23rd, he called the county commissioner's office to complain about Finch's conduct. A secretary took his message. No one called back. That silence confirmed everything Bill believed about the system. They didn't care. They would never care. The only language they understood was force. By early July, the plan was complete. They would strike at night, hitting multiple targets in rapid succession before law enforcement could respond. Speed and surprise were their only advantages. They knew they'd likely be caught, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was sending a message that would echo long after they were gone. Some decisions, once made, developed their own terrible momentum. Robert Finch spent his last evening at home with his wife, Karen, and their 2 children, ages 9 and 12. They ate dinner together, meatloaf and green beans, and watched television. Karen would later tell investigators that nothing seemed unusual. Robert hadn't mentioned any threats, hadn't expressed any concerns about his work. He'd kissed her goodnight at 10:30 and gone to bed. Across town, Deputy Thomas McCarty finished his shift at the Rains County Sheriff's Office. He was 26 years old, married 8 months. His wife was pregnant with their first child. He stopped at a gas station on his way home, bought a Coke and a bag of peanuts, exchanged pleasantries with the night clerk. Security camera footage would later timestamp this interaction at 11:42 p.m. Janet Holloway, who worked in the county assessor's office, lived alone in a rented house on the south edge of Emory. She was 53, twice divorced, planning to retire in 4 years. That evening, she'd talked on the phone with her daughter in Corpus Christi for nearly an hour, discussing Christmas plans even though it was July. She went to bed around midnight, her bedroom window open to catch the breeze. County Health Supervisor Douglas McBride and his wife were asleep by 11 p.m. in their home on Greenway Road. McBride had supervised Finch for 6 years, had backed every citation, every fine, every decision. He was 58, a former Army quartermaster, proud of his work. He had no reason to fear for his safety. These people, and 10 others across the county, had no idea what was coming. They'd gone to bed believing themselves safe in the ordinary rhythms of small-town Texas life. They didn't know that 3 desperate men were, at that very moment, loading weapons and driving into the darkness with murder in their hearts. The fog rolled in heavy around 1 a.m., reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. It was the kind of fog that muffled sound and disoriented even those familiar with the roads. Perfect conditions for what came next. The first shot was fired at 1:47 a.m. at Robert Finch's home on Meadowbrook Drive. Bill Turner approached the house on foot while Mark and James waited in the truck, engine running. Bill carried the .30-06, his father's rifle, the weapon that had fed his family during hard winters decades ago. He fired through the bedroom window, one shot, 2 shots, 3. Finch never woke. Karen Finch survived by rolling out of bed and crawling to her children's room. She heard footsteps on gravel, a truck door slamming, an engine racing away into the fog. By 2:15 a.m., Deputy McCarty was dead in his driveway, shot as he got out of his patrol car. The killers had been waiting in the darkness. He'd managed to key his radio. The recording captured the sound of gunfire, but no words, before collapsing. At 2:33 a.m., Douglas McBride died answering his front door. His wife saw 3 men silhouetted in the porch light before the shooting started. She survived by hiding in a closet. The men didn't enter the house. They simply moved to their next target. Over the next 4 hours, the Turner brothers moved through Rains County like a death squad, executing a military operation. They knew the roads, knew the shortcuts, knew where to find their targets. The fog provided cover. The late hour meant no witnesses. They encountered no resistance because their victims never had time to resist. Janet Holloway, County Clerk Michael Pearson, Building Inspector Roy Chandler, Planning Commissioner Arthur Hayes. Each name represented someone who, in Bill Turner's deteriorating mind, had contributed to his destruction. Each death was methodical, emotionless, quick. Some victims died in their sleep. Others answered their doors to gunfire. A few tried to run and were shot in their yards. The forensics report would later catalog 47 shell casings from 11 different locations, painting a picture of systematic annihilation. By dawn, 14 people were dead, and the Turner brothers had vanished into the East Texas wilderness they'd known their entire lives. The first 911 call came at 6:12 a.m. from Karen Finch. Her voice was steady, almost preternaturally calm, as she reported that someone had shot through her bedroom window and killed her husband. The dispatcher, assuming a domestic incident or random violence, sent 2 units. The second call came at 6:18 a.m. from a paperboy who'd found Deputy McCarty's body. The third call at 6:24 a.m. from McBride's wife. By 6:30 a.m., the Rains County Sheriff's Office knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. Sheriff Tom Briggs, 54 years old and sheriff for 16 years, had never worked a murder case. Rains County averaged 0 homicides per year. Bar fights, domestic disputes, drunk driving, that was the extent of violent crime in his jurisdiction. Now he had multiple murder scenes spread across 30 miles and no idea who was responsible or whether the killing had stopped. He called the Texas Rangers at 6:45 a.m. They arrived by helicopter 90 minutes later, along with FBI agents from the Dallas field office. By noon, over 50 law enforcement personnel were working the scenes, cataloging evidence, interviewing survivors, trying to piece together what had happened. The pattern emerged quickly. All victims were county employees or contractors who worked in regulatory enforcement. All had been shot with hunting rifles or shotguns. All had been killed in their homes or immediately outside them. None had been robbed. This wasn't random violence. It was targeted assassination. Ballistics analysis would eventually match the weapons to the Turner family, but the Turners were already gone. Their trailer sat empty, front door hanging open. The restaurant was locked and dark. Their trucks were missing. They'd prepared their escape as carefully as they'd planned the murders. A manhunt began. Roadblocks went up on every highway out of the county. Helicopters swept the wooded areas. Neighboring counties were alerted. But East Texas is vast, heavily forested, and filled with people who don't talk to law enforcement if they can avoid it. The Turner brothers had disappeared into country they knew intimately and where family connections ran deep. Bill Turner called the Emory police station at 4:37 p.m. on July 19th, 26 hours after the first killing. The duty officer recorded the conversation. Bill's voice was calm, measured, eerily rational. "This is Bill Turner. I'm calling to tell you we're done. We got who we needed to get. We're not looking to hurt anybody else, but we're not turning ourselves in neither. You want us? You'll have to come find us." "Mr. Turner, where are you?" the officer asked. "Doesn't matter. You tell that county that there's consequences for what they done. You tell them Bill Turner wasn't going to go down quiet." The line went dead. Attempts to trace the call led to a payphone outside a gas station in Hopkins County, 30 miles north. By the time deputies arrived, the Turners were gone. The call changed everything. Now law enforcement knew the killers were Bill Turner and his sons, knew the motive was revenge for the restaurant citations, knew the Turners considered their rampage complete. The question was whether to believe them. FBI behavioral analysts studied the crime scenes and the phone call. Their assessment: the Turners posed no further threat to civilians but would likely resist capture violently. They'd achieved their goal, punishing those they blamed for their troubles. Now they were in survival mode, trying to evade justice for as long as possible. Media descended on Emory. The story had everything reporters craved: small-town desperation, bureaucratic failure, shocking violence. National news networks ran segments. Newspapers published profiles of the victims and the killers. The Turner family restaurant became a macabre tourist attraction, people driving from Dallas and Houston to take photos of the closed building where it all started. For the families of the 14 dead, the media circus was unbearable. Karen Finch refused all interviews. McBride's wife moved out of state within a month. The deputy's widow miscarried from stress. These were the ripples of violence, not just the dead, but the living left to carry impossible grief. And still the Turners remained free. The manhunt stretched into its second week, then its third. Tips flooded in, sightings in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. Most proved false. A few led to abandoned campsites, evidence that the Turners had been there but moved on. They were surviving in the deep woods of East Texas, living off the land the way their grandfather had taught them. Hunting, fishing, sleeping rough, moving constantly. Bill had prepared for this, stockpiling supplies in hidden locations months earlier. Whether he'd planned the escape from the beginning or simply prepared for worst-case scenarios wasn't clear. Law enforcement faced a nearly impossible task. East Texas contains over 2 million acres of forest, much of it privately owned, some of it impenetrable. Local sympathy, while not unanimous, ran in unexpected directions. Many residents saw the Turners as desperate men pushed too far by government overreach, not cold-blooded killers. Tips were sparse. Cooperation was minimal. The economic context mattered. Rains County was dying. Anyone could see it. Factories closed, farms foreclosed, young people fled to cities. Government regulations seemed to kick people when they were already down, shutting down the few remaining businesses over violations that cost money to fix but didn't genuinely endanger anyone. The Turners' violence was inexcusable, but their desperation was widely understood. On August 7th, a hunter stumbled across a campsite in the Sabine National Forest. The site was abandoned but recent: tire tracks, cigarette butts, empty cans of Vienna sausages. The FBI moved in with dogs and helicopters. They found nothing but confirmation that the Turners had been there and left. As weeks became months, the manhunt scaled down. The FBI returned to Dallas. The Texas Rangers went back to their regular duties. Local sheriff's deputies continued patrols, but with diminishing hope. The case remained open, active in theory, but effectively cold. The Turners had vanished. Whether they'd fled to Mexico, died in the wilderness, or were being sheltered by sympathetic relatives, no one could say. They'd committed one of the most brutal mass murders in Texas history and simply disappeared into the landscape that had shaped them. On November 3, 1986, a deer hunter in the Davy Crockett National Forest found a 1979 Chevrolet C10 pickup truck abandoned in a ravine, partially covered with brush and branches. The license plate matched James Turner's vehicle. Inside, investigators found 3 rifles, ammunition, camping gear, and dried blood on the driver's seat. A search of the surrounding area revealed what the manhunt had missed. Approximately 200 yards from the truck, partially concealed under fallen timber, were 3 bodies in advanced stages of decomposition. Dental records confirmed their identities: Bill Turner, Mark Turner, and James Turner. The FBI forensics team reconstructed the scene. All 3 had died from gunshot wounds to the head, fired at close range. Bill's fingerprints were on the .357 revolver found near the bodies. The forensic evidence suggested a murder-suicide. Bill had shot his sons, then himself. The coroner estimated they'd been dead for at least 6 weeks, placing their deaths in mid-September. They'd survived nearly 2 months in the wilderness before whatever combination of exhaustion, despair, and logic had led Bill Turner to end it the only way he saw remaining. No suicide note was found. No final statement explained their decision. Whether they'd planned it from the beginning or whether weeks of running had simply worn them down to nothing, no one would ever know. The bodies were released to a distant cousin who arranged quiet burials in unmarked graves. No services were held. No obituaries were published. The Turner family simply ceased to exist, their name now synonymous only with violence and tragedy. For the families of the 14 victims, the Turners' deaths brought no closure. "I wanted to see them in court," Karen Finch told a reporter years later. "I wanted to look them in the eye and ask why. Them dying like that, it just left everything unfinished." The case was officially closed on December 1st, 1986. 14 murders, 3 suicides, no trial, no testimony, no public accounting of what had driven 3 desperate men to destroy so many lives, including their own. In the years following the massacre, Emory struggled to process what had happened within its borders. The Turner Fried Chicken building sat abandoned for 2 years before being demolished. No business ever replaced it. The lot remains empty today, a patch of cracked concrete and weeds that locals avoid discussing. The economic collapse that had provided context for the killings continued unabated. More businesses closed, more families left. By 1990, Emory's population had dropped below 800. The county that had once thrived on cotton and cattle became a place people drove through on their way to somewhere else. The victims were remembered differently depending on who was doing the remembering. Karen Finch established a scholarship fund in her husband's name for students pursuing careers in public health. The deputy's widow eventually remarried and moved to Arizona. Most of the other families simply tried to move on, finding what peace they could in private grief. The Turner massacre entered regional folklore as a cautionary tale, though people disagreed about what exactly the caution was. Some saw it as a warning against government overreach, others as proof that economic desperation breeds violence, still others as simple tragedy with no larger meaning to extract. Academic studies followed. Sociologists examined the role of rural poverty in producing explosive violence. Psychologists studied family dynamics in high-stress environments. Law enforcement agencies analyzed the manhunt to improve protocols. The Turner case became a data point, abstracted into charts and papers that bore little resemblance to the hot Texas night when 14 people died over a $500 fine. But for those who lived through it, the first responders who found the bodies, the neighbors who'd known the Turners, the children who grew up in the shadow of that violence, it remained stubbornly concrete. Not a case study or a cautionary tale, but a rupture in the fabric of ordinary life that never quite healed. Rains County still exists. People still live there, work there, raise families there. But anyone over 40 remembers July 1986, remembers when their quiet corner of Texas became a killing field for one terrible night. The abandoned Turner trailer stood on its 5-acre plot until 1992, when the county finally demolished it for unpaid taxes. Nothing remains now except foundation blocks and an overgrown driveway. The land reverted to cedar and mesquite, indistinguishable from the surrounding scrubland. In 2006, a journalist attempted to write a comprehensive account of the massacre. She interviewed surviving family members, reviewed court documents, and visited the locations where the killings occurred. Most people refused to talk. Those who did speak offered fragments, disconnected memories, unverifiable claims, long silences. The book was never published. The children of the victims carry their parents' absence in ways both visible and hidden. Karen Finch's son became a prosecutor. The deputy's daughter became a police officer. Others left Texas entirely, seeking distance from the place where their families were destroyed. None have spoken publicly about the massacre. In Emory, there is no memorial, no plaque, no official acknowledgement that 14 people died there in a single night. The town moved on the way small towns do, by not talking about it, by letting time bury what conversation couldn't resolve. Newer residents often don't know the history. Older ones know, but don't say. On quiet mornings when fog rolls across the county roads, the way it did that July night in 1986, you can drive past the empty lot where Turner Fried Chicken once stood and see nothing to suggest what happened there. The landscape has reclaimed its secrets. The violence has been absorbed into the Texas soil like spilled blood, into dirt, still there if you dig, but invisible on the surface. Bill Turner wanted to send a message about consequences, about dignity, about what happens when desperate men are pushed beyond endurance. The message was received. 14 families buried their dead. 3 men died in the wilderness they'd known all their lives. And in the end, nothing changed. The restaurant stayed closed. The county stayed poor. The fog still rolls in heavy some nights, muffling sound, obscuring vision, making even familiar roads feel strange and dangerous. The county road stayed empty. The holler never spoke of that night again.